From the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.
It's rolling.
Today is Sunday, March 17th, 2013, St. Patrick's Day. My name is John Dittmer, and I'm here in Arlington, Virginia with videographer John Bishop to interview Ms. Joan Trumpauer Mulholland, a leading activist in the civil rights movement. This interview will become part of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. We're delighted to be here today, and we thank you for taking the time to talk with us.
Rolling again.
Okay. I'd like to begin by asking about your home and family. Where were you born and raised?
Well, I was born in Washington, D.C. and raised in Arlington, Virginia, basically about a mile down the road in Buckingham Apartments, which at that point were known as being the only place in Northern Virginia that would rent to Jews. And this was early 40s. The folks had come from New York looking for that good government job in the Depression, met, now starting families, and wanted out of the boarding houses. And they could move to Buckingham, and that was about it. So
What do your folks do? What did your dad do?
oh, they had those good government jobs. My father came from Southwest Iowa during the Depression, and my folks met at the midnight shift at the old post office building in the elevator.
How romantic.
Mr. Trump. And when I was born, was working for the Department of Labor and continued in that, I guess, through the 50s, and then switched to the Department of State, but doing pretty much the same thing. And my mother had worked as a secretary and then became a stay-at-home mom, as was the custom. And she came from rural Georgia.
Mm-hmm. And what was it like growing up in Arlington in the 1940s?
In the 40s. Well, Arlington was definitely the South. Maybe not the Deep South, but everything by law and custom was segregated.
Mm-hmm.
So I lived in an all-white world, but with so many of my neighbors and their kids with this liberal New York Jewish outlook, I think that was one of the influences on me.
Mm-hmm. What about church? Was church important?
Church was a big part of my life. I was Presbyterian because where my dad grew up, it was a Swedish town, and the Lutheran church, which would have been the natural,
Mm-hmm.
was in Swedish.
Oh.
So all those others were Presbyterians.
Mm-hmm.
So I went to the Presbyterian church that was nearby, and we memorized all these Bible verses and got our gold star if we could recite it, Inasmuch as you've done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto me. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, for such is the kingdom of God. All that stuff. And sang those songs about Jesus loves the little children, red and yellow, black and white. But the church was segregated by law, and of course, as soon as we left the church, we continued to be hypocrites. And that bothered me. I was sort of a literalist,
Mm-hmm.
for better or worse.
So when you were a teenager, you were still going to church?
All through my
all
teenage
through?
years.
Okay. And this, what was race ever brought up in any context, in Sunday school or from the pulpit?
Not that I remember so openly, but I was always going to the Sunday evening youth fellowship.
Mm-hmm.
And once Sunday, we were told that next Sunday there would be some colored students coming to meet with us, but we were to keep this absolutely quiet.
Oh.
We were not to tell our parents, our friends, anybody. And the reasons being that the American Nazi Party was around the corner for their headquarters, and of course it was illegal, so the police could come.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the church, I don't know if elders is the word in the Presbyterians, but church leaders might be against this and lock us out and fire the minister forthwith. So we kept it quiet, and I guess at least twice this same group of students, organized through the Black Y, came and had our standard spaghetti dinner with us, and I don't remember what we talked about particularly, but this was in the throes of the county wanting to go along with Brown versus Board and the state of Virginia in the throes of massive resistance. This would have been the late 50s. So I think a lot of it was so that a few students would know each other across racial lines when it came. And I stayed in touch with one of the girls for a while.
Were these the first real conversations you had with black people?
Yes, and the first with white, too. Years later, I tried to track this down a bit, and I should get back to that. There was a county gathering at the school that was the first integrated, and I raised the question, could anybody fill me in on how this was organized? Did the white ministers reach out? Did the black community reach out to the white ministers? Was this happening all over the county and we just didn't know about it? Nobody knew a thing. One woman said she thought if anyone knew, it would be her mother, who was ill and could not make it that night, and she would ask her, but a week later her mother was dead. I'd still like to know.
Yeah.
I've heard that it may have been happening a couple other white churches, but
In 1955, Emmett Till was murdered. He was your age. For black activists in the South, this was a turning point, something that they would never forget, and made them realize how vulnerable they were and how rotten the system was if they didn't already know. Did the lynching of Till have any impact up here? Were you aware of it?
I don't even think I was aware of it.
Yeah.
If I may have heard of it, but it was not a big deal.
That was the same thing in Indiana. I vaguely remember and saying, "Oh, that's too bad." But
Yeah, but grew up down at Grandma's in Georgia, that there would be discussions of the Leo Frank lynching. So the concept of lynching was not shocking, because there would always be these big debates as to whether Leo Frank was innocent or guilty. And the lynch mob had gone by my aunt's house, as I understood it. So, lynching was not breaking news.
what was it like at Grandma's when you were visiting?
Oh, it was wonderful. Fresh biscuits every meal, and grits and snap beans, and great time.
Did you go every year? Or?
Every year we'd go down for 2 weeks. My mother would load the girls in the car, me and my sister, and drive down. 3-day trip, back before the interstate. And
Where'd your grandmother live in Georgia?
Oconee, which at that point was a company town out in the swamps for the logging.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I know that area.
The town was Oconee, down near Gardner's, not Oconee County.
What was it that motivated you to become involved in the civil rights struggle that was just now beginning to, in the late 1950s, was beginning to attract attention? You had Martin Luther King and the Montgomery bus boycott. You had the Little Rock Nine.
Well, I think, going back with this memorizing the Bible verses, and then we had the Declaration of Independence in high school. We had to memorize it. And once when I was down at Grandma's, I must have been about 10, this girl that I used to hang out with sort of dared each other to go walk through Niggertown, as we called it, and just the striking disparity. Of course, everyone just sort of evaporated as we saw these two white girls coming down the road, but I could see with my own eyes the difference between the black school and the white school that was the new brick building and all that, and that really struck me. And then in high school, the girl next to me in Spanish class had been in one of those jurisdictions in Virginia where the schools were closed. So instead of enjoying her senior year, she was sent to live with relatives or somebody and do an 11th grade a year late. And just seeing the effect of segregation and knowing the hypocrisy of it from what our founding documents and the Bible, I just sort of felt as a Southerner that we needed to change. And when I had my chance to help do something, I would seize it.
Oh, you're anticipating my next question, and that is a broader question, that Southerners were the first white people to seek out the young black activists in SNCC and CORE, talking about people like you, Bob Zellner, Casey Hayden. Why do you think it was white Southerners who were first in the movement rather than Northerners?
Because those Yankees up there were looking down their nose at us. And well, we were at home. We were working at home on what we saw as our own problems. Think globally, act locally, bloom where you're planted. Those sayings came in later. But back then, we were very local oriented. Particularly in the South, we had to be able to place people, know where you were from, who you were related to. Very community minded. A trip to the next state was a big deal for some people, to the next county. And so I think it was natural between our community orientation and our deep religious convictions.
Well, Casey was saying that it was through the Methodist Church, going to interracial meetings out of state, that she first became involved in activities.
And for me, the Presbyterians, my Presbyterian youth group, and then I went to Duke University because my mother wanted me to go to a name school that was safely segregated.
What would have been your first choice?
It was some small church school in the north, I think maybe Ohio, but I'd gone to such a massive high school that it was just totally overcrowded with growing suburbia in the 50s, that I wanted a small place where you were known, for better or worse, but not where you were lost in the mob. And Mother was afraid of integration, product of her environment, and she was all about status. So I went to Duke, but it was there after the sit-ins got going in Durham that our Presbyterian chaplain, and I was going to their Sunday evening meetings, told us, and it's like deja vu, that some students from North Carolina College who were doing the sit-ins would be coming over next week. Don't spread the word unless it's somebody you think would really want to come, because the administration could lock us out, the police could show up, or the local rowdies could visit us. And these well-dressed, well-spoken students came over and explained all about the sit-ins legally and morally, and at the end invited us to join them. That was my moment.
Yes. Before we get to that, what were your impressions? Tell us what Duke was like in 1959.
All about status. It was big. It was, well, I don't know that it was literally dripping ivy, but it certainly fits that impression. By chance, luck of the draw, I had a roommate from New York, not the city, but out that way. And we decided we didn't want to rush with the sororities.
That was a big decision.
The first or second week, you were no more on campus and didn't have your bearings, and they had rush, which meant you got dressed up and went and sat and got picked over by these girls that you didn't know to see if you were suitable for an organization that you really didn't know either. And it cost money. And the International Club, which was basically graduate school guys, was having a potluck party the same night. And we thought, oh, graduate guys, this sounds much better. So we went to that. On my lands, Duke rather got upset with this. They sent counselors around to see if we were unhappy. Was it a financial situation?
Just because you didn't rush?
Just because we didn't rush. I heard that it had never happened in the history of the universities before, which I think probably made me all the more determined not to do it. But, you know, graduate school guys were good news.
Yeah. So there was a lot of status.
Oh, it was all about status, just what Mom wanted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. The sit-ins, they started, you were still a freshman.
I was a
The
freshman.
second semester.
Yes.
Tell us about your involvement beginning with that.
Well, they invited us to join, and a few graduate guys, and Lucia and I, fortunately, we were roommates, went down and got on the picket lines. And then when it came time for a sit-in, which wasn't too long into it, we joined them at the lunch counter. I don't have strong memories of it now, you know, the details, but twice in jail, and it was.
Were you nervous? I mean, this is a big change for the way you were brought up.
I don't remember being nervous as such, but in jail, I mean, it was fairly quick, so there wasn't time to be, and you were surrounded by fellow sit-in folks.
Where were you when you were arrested?
I think it was Cress, but I really couldn't swear to it. Woolworth.
And you
Cress.
went in and sat down.
Went in, sat down.
Integrated group.
Mm-hmm. And I don't remember if the whites sat down first or not, but there weren't that many whites, so I suspect we just sort of went in and sat down.
Were you told to leave, or were you just arrested right away?
I don't remember, but generally you were asked to leave. But in jail, the whites were. That's where it could had its potential for being scary. That you were in with the regular white prisoners or by yourself,
Yeah.
and you didn't know what would happen. I think some of the guys were roughed up. Well, one of my favorite moments comes out of that. When after we got out of jail and we were talking about it with the black students, and they'd had a pretty good time because Durham was not the Deep South. They'd made the most of it. And once they realized that the white students didn't have quite such a good time, we came up with a plan. An awful lot of us had Native American ancestry or claim to, black and white. So, North Carolina state law, someone checked it, provided for separate cells for white men, white women, colored men, colored women, and others. Didn't say anything about men others and women others, just others. And so we decided we would all be others. Get arrested on Friday, refuse bail, insist on being locked up together in one cell, and party all weekend. And make bail Monday morning to get to class.
Did it work?
No, Attorney McKissick said that was frivolous, but it was a great plan. The other moment from that, I understand we would have been expelled. The administration at Duke wanted to kick us out and called us over to the dean's office. When we got back from jail, there was a note in our mailbox saying to call the dean, and she wanted us to report to her office, which was, by now it's after dark, and it's the only light on in the building. I had to walk over to this administrative building, and we came in, and she locked the door and put the key in her pocket. And we had quite a little discussion, and had we called our parents, well, of course, neither one of us had, Lucia and me. So there's the phone. And obviously we weren't getting out since she had the key in her pocket until we made the phone call. And I've understood since then that we would have been expelled except the professional organization for the professors and their associates.
AAUP?
Yeah, they intervened. But I remember telling one of my English teacher, that going on, sit-in was coming up, and if I were in jail and he gave a pop quiz, could I make it up? Because he was good at pop quizzes. And he sort of laughed and smiled and said, "No, I'll just bring it down to the jail. You can't cheat in there."
That's wonderful.
And so we had support from the faculty, just not from the administration.
Duke have a separate women's and men's college then? Or,
Yeah.
You're on your
Separate
own
campuses.
Yeah, yeah. And so it was that you were very much isolated there.
Now there was a bus that ran between
Yeah.
campuses, and you might, particularly after your freshman year, cross over to the other campus for a class or a special event in the chapel, and because the men's campus had the chapel. But
What was that phone call like to your mother?
couldn't have been good. I don't remember a whole lot about it, but
You've spoken very openly about your mother being a segregationist.
yeah, product of her environment. My mother, I've heard in recent years from one of her friends, thought I had been sort of sucked up into a cult.
So you need to be debriefed or deprogrammed.
Brainwashed out of it, yeah. And plus it went against everything she had grown up and believed in. I can say that a little more generously now than
Yeah,
I could have
yeah.
then.
So was there tension at home when you went home?
Oh yeah, lots of tensions, and I don't think things really got on anything like a normal footing. Never really normal, but didn't like it until the grandkids came along.
Yeah. How did your dad react to all this?
Well, my dad, I think first and foremost, was afraid his darling daughter was going to get killed. And being a good government bureaucrat, he believed in working from the top down, you know, Brown versus Board
Yeah.
versus take it to the streets. That with a demonstration, you might have an effect very locally, but there was all the rest of the area that took a Supreme Court decision.
And John, let's pause first. Okay, we're back.
Well, so you had your freshman year at Duke. Did you go back? Where were you in the fall?
I dropped out. In the fall, I was out of school working on the Hill.
Talk about that.
By fall, I was living in D.C.
On your own.
on my own, and I think trying to remember exactly. I'd gotten back the government job I'd had, which was a summer temp that I'd had making money to go to college down at the FCC. And that ran out, and then I ended up getting a job with some Wisconsin senator, just very menial office work, and then Senator Engel eventually. But I had joined up with the Howard Group, Nonviolent Action Group.
Now that is something that I want you to talk about a little bit more. This was, for that time, probably the most militant group of activists that were around. How did you did you just walk onto the Howard campus?
Yeah,
How
well,
did you get involved?
When
with
I
it?
was leaving North Carolina, some of the students at NCC said, well, now we haven't heard anything from Howard since the founding meeting of SNCC at Shaw at Easter break, and we haven't heard anything from them. So when you get up there, go up to Howard and find out what's happening, and if they're not doing anything, get something going. Well, of course, I had no clue where Howard really was, growing up in Arlington. And but I got there and was walking around campus, looking lost and asking people, stopping them if they knew anybody who was involved with student demonstrations or sit-ins or what have you. And I understand that they had been having sympathy pickets at, say, downtown Walworth and things like that. But there was a meeting planned that night or the next or something to talk about sit-ins. They were planning, as it turned out, to go to Arlington because I think some diplomatic sorts had been denied service. Well, I was from Arlington. I had a little experience with sit-ins in jails, so I was welcomed into the group. Now, it wasn't just students at Howard University. It was people from the community, some with core affiliations and what have you, and possibly, I think, other universities in town. And so we went out to Arlington and sat in, and the American Nazi Party showed up and went to the local high school and encouraged kids getting out of school to come up where we were sitting down in Cherrydale. And
Who were the activists that you remember from NAG?
well, the main leaders were two older guys, in their mid-20s maybe.
Yeah.
Lawrence Henry and Paul Dietrich, Paul was white. Lawrence was a divinity school student, and there was Michael Proctor, who went on to be a doctor, and there was Dion Diamond, who's still around.
Became a full-time activist?
Oh, yeah. Those are the main ones I remember. But
Was Stokely there then?
no, Stokely apparently came down with a group from New York to see what was happening with the students in D.C., but he was not a Howard student until that fall.
Okay. So you were really there before Stokely came and Cleve Sellers and others who...
Yeah. This was not a particularly militant group then.
And it was integrated.
It was integrated. Gwen and Connie Green. I have a whole list of them upstairs.
Yeah.
Somebody who's writing a book just asked who was at those counters, and I got out the old clippings and wrote down all the names about a month ago. I think there were about 13 of us, to be 12 or 13 the first day. We sat at one place, I think the drug fair, which is now gone, and then some moved down to People's. I mean, they closed the counters, but did not ask the police to arrest us or anything, but crowds were coming in because school was letting out. I really think, though I haven't researched this or know, that these were local chains, locally owned, People's and Drug Fair, probably with these same sort of liberal New York Jewish connections. The founders of them, the owners, and particularly Drug Fair I know was, and that they were not going to break the state law by integrating. They were sort of waiting to be forced.
Yeah.
And after about a week of demonstrations, including down at Woolworth's in Shirlington, right near where we ate, then we had a couple of department stores also, so locally owned chains, New York Jewish. We had a cooling off period, negotiating period that lasted about a week, and then lo and behold, they were open.
Oh.
So in retrospect, I really think they were just waiting to have their hand forced, and they said they'd serve everybody, and the police said, well, they weren't going to take the initiative to enforce segregation laws if they wanted to serve us.
I wonder, was
John, could you take it's just rubbing a little bit on there. That's good. You can be comfortable. This is starting to rub.
Oh, sorry.
No problem.
let's see, now I lost my train of thought.
I'm going to stop
Yeah,
there.
I'm ready.
We're going.
You were in Arlington, did anybody recognize you? Any
I don't think
local
so.
folks that didn't make the newspaper, that
Well, it made
white
the
girl was stirring up trouble?
pictures were in the newspaper, but I don't think anybody really connected this with. My family had moved out to Fairfax County by then, and if anyone connected this, I didn't hear about it.
And what next happened with NAG? Talk about that whole period of your life.
Well, the lunch counters are integrated. School year was over. What are we going to do now? Let's take it to the beach. But, of course, the beaches were a bit of a drive. Couldn't really commute back and forth on that one so easily. So Glen Echo became the next one. And I wasn't in on the planning end of things. I'd just show up after work.
What was Glen Echo?
Glen Echo was an Disney of its day. It was an amusement park, and it was where white Washington went for summer fun. And, of course, segregated. And there was a Bannockburn community, which was sort of a co-op community of the same sort of Jews who had lived in Buckingham, and then after World War II were wanting housing. And of course there were restrictive covenants in a lot of the housing. So they started this community over near Glen Echo in Maryland. And they had been pushing the county, Montgomery County, was sending in the summer programs the white kids to swim at Glen Echo and the black kids into D.C. And they wanted everyone to go to the same place, Glen Echo. So they had been petitioning the county, or starting to raise a ruckus on this. And I don't know how much some of the folks in NAG may have been aware of this, but anyway, we all ended up at the same place. And I and maybe some other folks could, of course, buy tickets. You had tickets, and if you wanted a ride, you gave a ticket for the ride. And I went and bought a whole bunch of tickets and handed them over to the black students, who then could go zooming through the arch and down to the merry-go-round or whatever, and get arrested on the merry-go-round, which of course doesn't have a back to be at. And this later got into the whole issue, as I understand it, of private security guards or whatever being used to enforce the state law or whatever. But the use of private guards in making an arrest on this. And so after they were arrested, it became a summer-long picket with strong support from the Bannockburn community of union-made signs and sandwiches and picking us up on hot days and taking over to their homes for a little R&R and lemonade and pit stops. And the American Nazi Party was out.
Was that
Again.
George Lincoln Rockwell? Was he
Yes,
there?
George Lincoln Rockwell, he made it to the lunch counters in Arlington with swastikas, and he made it to Glen Echo, which was, got a little tense because you had folks from the World War II concentration camps with numbers on their arms. So the police required a certain degrees of separation. So you had pickets and counter pickets, and occasionally somebody driving by the road there and yelling something or throwing a little something. But basically it was just pretty long, peaceful summer
What was the
picketing.
upshot? What happened?
Closed, segregated, and the next year it opened, integrated.
So another victory.
Another victory, but the days of places like Glen Echo were numbered. Small, non-chain amusement parks. Plus, they stopped running the trolley out there, which was the main way folks got out there. The trolley ride out as a kid was almost as exciting as being in the amusement park.
Yeah. So you had frequented the park.
Oh yeah, at least once a year you got your mom to take you out there, and it was one of the big events of the summer.
What else with NAG?
Well, NAG was sort of have movement, will travel. There was a theater, I think, in Bethesda where there was a picket line, and I think we went as far as Hagerstown maybe, and out toward the eastern shore. And then with the JLN in Rock Hill, South Carolina, the call went out to come down and join them.
Did you go?
Well, a bunch of us went down as sort of a weekend support thing. We did not go for the JLN, but we went down that way, and I was in contact with Reverend Ivy, who was the adult college contact on that.
This must have been your first active action in the Deep South.
That was the furthest south I'd been at that point.
What was did that differ? I mean, you were in Durham and Duke, of course, a great progressive state of North Carolina. Arlington's a suburb of Washington, not as reactionary. But now you're in Rock Hill, where terrible things were going on.
Well, I didn't feel, terrified or anything. It was just the next step, and we were sort of an on-call movement,
Mhm.
NAG, and I may have been. I remember we visited jail where some folks were from D.C. Frank Hunt was in jail. He was a reporter for Afro. Some of our group did get some NAG folks got arrested, but did not stay the whole sentence. And I've heard that I was arrested, but I think I was just. I don't even remember being booked. I may have been booked, but I think it may have been more of a protective custody. We're taking you in type of thing.
Yeah.
There was never any trial or what have you.
Were there many whites on this particular venture?
I don't remember it racially. I would say it was predominantly black. NAG was predominantly
So maybe
black.
they were singling you out because they didn't want you to.
Paul Dietrich may have been in on that, but if we were picketing, and I think things were on the rough side. They may have been justified as protective custody. I'm not.
Yeah.
I just don't remember.
Uh-huh.
And
Was Carmichael there then? Or?
I don't remember Carmichael then.
Mm-hmm. So were you still working on the Hill while you're doing all this? You were.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you were just sort of.
Now the thing that's interesting to me about Rock Hill, and this diverges a little bit from me, but to draw the connection, the Diane Nash of the Nashville movement was one of the people who had answered the call. And this was like in February or something, January, February, I'd have to check. But in December, the Supreme Court had made a ruling on the facilities and interstate commerce. Diane was in the jail stayed the sentence. Tom Gaither was down there from CORE. Leaving Rock Hill after the jail end, Tom and I think Carrie, on a Greyhound bus, started talking about doing something to test the Supreme Court ruling, and the whole idea of the Freedom Ride was formed. SNCC had its April meeting in Charlotte and referred back to the Supreme Court decision and called for students to test the ruling, not necessarily get arrested in a strange town, but see if it's being enforced. Well, you had this SNCC thing that came out in April. Diane had just been in the jail so when all hell broke loose in May in Alabama, things were primed from two directions for the student movement. The kids who had been in the Deep South, in the South with the sit-ins, to continue. Yeah, it was just like you had been priming it.
Yeah. Well, the Freedom Ride started in Washington, didn't it?
Started in Washington.
Were you aware of what was going on? And
Oh, yeah. Paul Dietrich's, who was one of our leaders, it was the restaurant that he was manager at, the Chinese restaurant where they had the Last Supper. Hank Thomas was one of the original 13, and of course John Lewis was involved in this, so he was a SNCC person. So we were, well aware of it. So when the bus was burned in Anniston, and there was the picture of Hank standing outside the burning bus, NAG was just as quick out of the chute as Nashville, but Nashville is closer to Alabama, so they got there first.
Yeah.
But I mean, 3 of our guys left right away. Paul, John Moody, and Dion Diamond. But by the time they could get down there without all the interstates, things had moved to Montgomery. And they were trapped in that church that was surrounded by everyone and the tear gas and all that. And Paul called me from the basement of the church when you had like a minute or two to call. He knew I was in an efficiency apartment and the phone was very close to the bed. That was better to call that than, say, a dormitory at Howard where you'd have to go wandering around and your 2 minutes would be up. And it was just that we're trapped in the church. I can't talk, but send more people.
No.
And we started sending more.
So on May 4th, 1961, 13 Freedom Riders leave Washington on a bus tour of the South to test the Supreme Court ruling. A month later, you were arrested in Jackson, Mississippi. We were just talking about you're getting the phone call from the church in Montgomery that was surrounded saying, send more people. What happened next?
Well, we started trying to get folks from NAG, see who could go, and filtering them in 2 or 3 at a time. Actually, NAG ended up sending second only to Nashville in numbers of the students in the Southern student movement. So we were right there, just further. So by the time I went, things had gotten very routine. The Kennedys had struck their bargain with the power structure. You came into Jackson.
Talk about what was the bargain that they...
The deal was the Kennedys didn't like the bad PR worldwide, and Kennedy and Khrushchev were going to be do-si-doing. And it was bad press. They wanted that stopped. Mississippi wanted to arrest those outside agitators. So Mississippi agreed there would be no violence like Alabama, but they could arrest people on a local charge. So we were charged with breach of peace, meaning we made other people feel like beating us up. So you got off the train, you got off the bus, whatever, Captain Ray would arrest you. Y'all move on, move out. Did you hear me? You going to do it? You're under arrest. And then you got to the paddy wagon. And it had gotten down scripted by the time I got down there.
How did you get there?
We flew to New Orleans, a group
We being...
of naggers, Stokely Carmichael and Jane Rosette, Gwen Green, Travis Britt, and those 2 later married, in spite of what Stokely wanted to do. Helene Wilson, and a couple more joined us from other places. In New Orleans, we had a day or so of orientation, not real training as I remember, because we were already trained, and got the train tickets and got off in Jackson, and didn't try to get off anywhere else. There were police, there were maybe a few rough-looking characters on the platform, but that's probably true on any given day on the train platforms. And there were some white college students in the car who made a couple little remarks, but you know, nothing you wouldn't.
got off the train and you walked
in Jackson, after a pretty much uneventful ride, walked into the train station, did our little do-si-do with Captain Ray, walked out to the paddy wagon. Now, why were you going to the Negro side, or how were you arrested? I think we were all in the white side, but as a group, black and white together. And
so you were breaching the peace just as anyone else was.
yeah, we were making whoever might be hanging out waiting for us feel like hitting us. But when we got to the city jail, what has really stuck with me is it was sort of a big step down from the paddy wagon, and I was looking like this sweet young thing, and the police officer just automatically reached out to help me down. Now, he would not have done this if I were black, I know that.
But call you ma'am?
We don't want anything to happen to y'all.
Oh.
And then it was like he was struck by lightning. Oh my God, what am I doing? And jerked his hand back. But what has stuck with me that his first instinct was good.
Yeah.
Wouldn't have been good if I were black, but he showed a definite humanity
Civility.
there.
Yes.
Yeah, and that sort of gave me faith that it was all going to be okay in the end.
Okay.
Which I mentioned it when the Freedom Riders were back and treated to brunch at the governor's mansion, and I told that story and wanted to thank those who had helped to make that true, as we had the black chief of police, the black head of the state highway patrol, you know, all of them were, et cetera, were,
Haley Barbour.
and Haley Barbour, who did more than he's generally credited with.
Yeah. So you were taken to the Hinds County Jail.
No, we were taken to the city jail
City
first
Okay.
with my lovely mug shot
Mm-hmm.
and
Famous photo. Now famous.
infamous. I think I look sort of calmer in that than most of the freedom riders, women,
Mhm.
white women, because I was within my own culture.
Yeah, you're right. The book of photographs of all of them.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you look like it might be your yearbook photo.
Yeah, but I was at home,
Mhm.
whereas all these folks that came from the north
Mm-hmm.
were going into a war zone in their mind,
Mm-hmm.
a hostile territory, and they didn't feel one bit comfortable. Furthermore, they couldn't understand the language and know what the food was. I had to explain that.
Yes, yes, you were their ambassador.
But we were in the city jail until our trial.
How long was that?
Oh, that just took a few minutes. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't even know. I don't remember if we were overnight or not. But the trial was scripted, literally. And then we were taken over to the county jail. And that, of course, all the cells were segregated. And the women's cell, white women's cell, where I was, before we were taken to Parchman, it had gotten so crowded that if you don't count the space taken up by the shower stall or the bunks, we had less than 3 square feet of floor space per person.
Wow.
Now, we had people sleeping under the bunks, doubling up. One person curled up in the shower stall, and it dripped all night. But they needed bigger facilities. But I felt so culturally isolated from all these Yankee girls
Mm-hmm.
that I had more culturally in common with the black girls in the next cell who were Southerners.
Yeah.
And we knew about grits,
Yeah.
black-eyed
Yeah,
peas.
Yeah.
And years later, one of my cellmates that I've become good friends with, it's up in Minnesota, she's the one who wants to go to Ireland to visit her father's home country. Her main memory of me is sitting over by the wall where I could talk to the black girls.
Oh.
That I was culturally and just separate from the white girls from New York and California and such.
Yeah. Did you have any visitors while you were in Jackson jail?
Well, the lawyers got by a few times. Women Power Unlimited.
Talk about that. Clarice Collins Harvey. That's a group that people should know more about.
They don't get the credit they should. It was a group of, as I understand it, basically black church women, but also some white church women working on almost a cell basis, at least in the white community, where nobody knew but one other person in another cell to support the Freedom Riders, raise money, the attorney, and get us things we needed, and we could get a lot of things in the jail then. We literally made out a list, shower shoes, T-shirts, we got postage stamps, paper, sanitary products, toothbrushes, anything we might need. They got the money to get it for us. And it got delivered to the cell. I finally gave my shower shoes to the Old State Capitol Museum where they
Oh,
displayed them until
wow.
the Katrina came through.
Oh.
And then after we got out of jail, because it was fill the jails, but with a 6-month sentence that a lot of folks got, you didn't want to spend 6 months at Parchman, so you had 39 days to bail.
Mm-hmm.
But after you got out, then they arranged, showers, homes you could stay in overnight, get a shower, get clean clothes. I got clothes given to me when I got out because you basically had the clothes on your back that you'd worn when you got arrested.
So you weren't prepared. You didn't have a bag with you or anything when you came into.
Just had a little overnight case of stuff which you had to turn over at
Yeah.
Parchman, and they rifled through, and so you might not get back everything. Often you had a change of clothes in it, but what you had when you got out of jail was a little iffy. But a good hot meal, a nice soft bed, a shower, shampoo, all these good things.
Yeah,
that Women Power Unlimited organized on an ongoing
The
basis.
founder of that, Clarie Collins Harvey,
Mm-hmm.
ran one of the leading funeral parlors in town.
Yes.
Quite an amazing woman.
You probably know a lot more about Women Power Unlimited than I do.
Well, the daughter of Ylvester Simpson,
Mm-hmm.
T.E. Morris, has written a book-length manuscript on women power that I read. So yes, I do.
Oh, I hope that gets to be a book, because
Yes,
I would love
it
to
is.
know more.
Because again, the focus is away from the local people and all on the people coming in from the outside, but the locals were active.
I met on a trip somewhere in the Arctic, I would say probably off Baffin Island on a ship, some women from Jackson. Just by chance, it was open seating for the meals, and was sad to know, where are you from, da-dee-da-dee-da. And I'd been in Mississippi. Oh, where in Mississippi? And Tougaloo. Ooh. And did I know anything about the civil rights movement? And they said that, yeah. But these two elderly women were saying that back in that time, they kept telling the people at their church that these folks are not violent, they're not really breaking the law. You know, they were very supportive verbally, and how much they may have done under the cover, I don't know. But it was so nice for them to hear that what they had been saying was true,
Yeah.
that we weren't all a pack of wild-eyed communists. I was invited over for tea sometime when I was passing through Jackson, and took them up on it. But, you know, this was people coming out of the woodwork years later.
Yeah. And of course the newspapers, the Hedderman Press.
Oh, my.
Did you read the Clarion Ledger and Daily News when you were in jail? Did you have?
Sometimes we got that at in Hinds County. We'd get the trustees would take care of us that way.
Do you remember your trial at all? It was a quick one, wasn't it?
Very quick, and like I say, it was literally scripted.
Mm-hmm.
And I got 2 months suspended, $200 fine. They kept upping it, and I was sort of at the medium level. Then before long, it was up to 6 months, $500, which was the max.
And so, what were you thinking? Parchman Penitentiary is one of the most notorious, one of the most notorious reputations in the country. It was a cotton plantation. It was isolated out in the middle of nowhere.
Not far from where Emmett Till was murdered. Yep.
So you're on your way up, and was there conversation? What were you anticipating?
They weren't really telling us where we were going. There were rumors that we were going to be taken to Parchman. And I think some of the guys may already have been taken up. But you were so isolated, even in the county jail, as far as who you had communication with.
How long were you in the county jail?
A couple weeks.
Uh-huh.
Kept a diary, hidden in my skirt.
Mm-hmm.
Still have it. But when they actually took us, they didn't say where we were going. We were loaded into the back of I guess it was a paddy wagon or a truck-like paddy wagon thing, and taken up. Now, I knew just intellectually, I'd heard of Parchman, that it was bad, but the full horror of it had not reached Northern Virginia. Angola you heard more about, at least up here. But the scary part of the ride, aside from not knowing where you're going, and some of the other girls had heard more about Parchman than I had, was when the driver turned off the road. And this was before interstates.
Yeah.
This was the 2-lane, and he turned off, went back a bit where there was this house, and these guys were coming and looking in on us. And we didn't know what was going to happen. Some of us thought we'd get killed. In retrospect, he probably needed a pit stop and was seizing the moment at a friend's house. But anything could have happened, and, you know, things like that did happen.
Went through the gates.
Went through the gates, basically stripped. They gave us the coarse black and white striped skirts and I think a t-shirt for a top, and took our stuff and bagged it and even gave most of it back at the end. And then we had the vaginal exam, which was nasty.
Yeah.
One of my friends said thought that the woman who was doing it to us, who was matron, probably, she seemed uncomfortable with it. One of the same person I'm good friends with now didn't remember this at all.
Wow. Just blocked it out.
Yeah, but then when we talked about it, well, she knew that the smell of Lysol gave her the chills.
Still.
Yeah, this was a good 45 years after the fact, but she didn't remember. She didn't know why.
Oh, how interesting.
She had completely blocked out the vaginal exam, but the smell just still got to her.
So you're put in a segregated wing.
We're putting it, well, the cells were segregated, but it's this one cell block, so it's just one side of the wing, but it could be a white cell, a black cell, a black cell, a white
So
cell.
it was just segregated by sex then.
It was there were no guys around, but say 2 or 3 white girls would be in together, but the next cell would be all black.
So you
So-
had communication.
You had communication, but you didn't see people. You knew voices, perhaps. And actually, it was at the Freedom Rider reunion thing that I met this one woman, Helen Singleton, from California. And she remembered my voice and name, but she had no idea what I looked like.
Oh.
And it was like, oh wow, this was a great moment. But if you would go down the cell block for a shower, but the matron would be on this between you and the other cell, the cells, and you would just zoom down it and back, so you didn't really get to see people and connect a face with a voice and name. So we were in the cell block, not really having any mental image of the prison farm beyond our cell block. We knew it was death row, but we didn't know exactly where the death chamber
They
was.
cleaned out death row for you.
Yeah, they cleaned it. And actually,
Could you just say that?
what?
Could you just say that?
They cleaned out death row, emptied it out, and it was much cleaner, and the food was a lot better, and we had a lot more room per cell, per person, than we'd had at Hinds County.
So Parchman was a step up then.
In physically it was a step up. But in Hinds County, you could scream bloody murder, or you could even sing as a group, and they could hear you on the streets of Jackson. Here, as they pointed out to us, no reporters are going to get you. So the psychological component, after you go through this little exam and then you're in complete isolation and at their mercy, really played on a lot of minds.
What was a typical day like in Parchman? You woke up and
You woke up, you got breakfast, you had,
what was breakfast?
I don't remember anything noteworthy,
Yeah,
grits,
yeah.
fat back, that type of thing. The one meal I really remember, the food to me was unremarkable, but it was Southern, so it was normal, was we had fried chicken and lemonade for the 4th of July. And Mississippi had not been celebrating the 4th of July for that long because Vicksburg had fallen on the 4th. Plus the fireworks never got down there in time anyway, leading to a great New Year's. But I was surprised that they would do something special for the 4th of July, especially for us.
Did you?
We got coffee. That's where I took up drinking coffee.
What did you do with all your spare time during the day?
Well, we had some quiet times. We had reading,
You could get books.
New Testament,
Oh, that was it.
and that led to some fussing by the Jewish girls, and I think they got Old Testaments in on that one. Made decks of cards out of. We could get mail, censored mail, once a week on a good week, and send out a letter. So we could use the envelopes and things from our mail to make a deck of cards and play solitaire. In fact, my deck of cards I'd forgotten about, but it's at the American History Museum.
What were your conversations like with the women in the other cells?
Would be getting news, if you had the new folks come in, you get the world news and what have you. Maybe where they were from, where they went to school, just routine stuff. And then we would have lectures, and we had people who had expertise. We had one woman who was a Greek classics professor. And so we would have lectures, college level lectures.
So you're all sitting in cells, and you hear this voice that you can't see, who is educating you.
Yes. And somebody might know a language, this language or that language, and we would be having lectures in Swahili or French or whatever. And we'd have quiet time.
And this is quiet time.
This is, quiet time that, for a while somebody would announce it. But we had exercise time. Somebody's counting out 1, 2, 3, 4, and you'd be doing whatever exercise was announced.
How much time did you have outside of your cell?
Well, I think maybe just twice a week you got a shower, walk down, quick shower, and back.
You had toilets in your cell?
We had toilets and a wash basin.
Wash basin.
Now
Can
the
you
size.
describe the cell like that?
The cell was, I think it was maybe 7 or 8 feet long. 8 might be a stretch, and maybe 6 feet across. I figured it out once that it was a little bit smaller than the cell that Nelson Mandela spent years in, and we had up to 3 or 4 people in it, but usually 2. You'd put this in mattresses unless they got, you aggravated the jailers by singing and they could take your mattresses away.
Did they do that? I knew that they did that for the guys.
Oh, they did it, yeah. And there were bunks, and it was like a metal sheet with these little holes in it, which made it, softer, but it could be a little uncomfortable without the mattress and cold.
Did you sing a lot?
Oh, yeah. We'd be singing. Now, those Yankees didn't know how to sing. They had sort of a union singing, whereas we had a spiritual singing in the South.
Yeah.
And
Didn't know how to clap either.
oh, heavens no. No, their clapping was way off. And I can't carry a tune in a bucket, but I knew they didn't know how to sing. Now, the other time the lawyer could come once a week, and he'd work down the cell block, but always accompanied by somebody from the prison.
Who was your lawyer?
It varied who came up, but you had Jack Young and Carsey Hall, and
These are
I
local-
think
local
R.J.S.
black-
Brown, local black
local
lawyers. I don't think that you had to be a member of the Mississippi Bar. You couldn't have Attorney Kunstler or Kanoy coming down because they weren't recognized. And then there was about a 2-hour window, or maybe 3 hours, once a week, that a religious person could come.
Talk about Rabbi Nussbaum.
Yeah, we're getting to him.
Okay.
Rabbi Nussbaum is truly one of my heroes. He would drive up from Jackson, where the Jewish community was not, smiled upon by the power structure, every week faithfully. And I figured the only reason he was not killed on one of those roads is that the power structure had given the word, don't kill him. But, you could have had a rogue Klansman any day take him out. He came up faithfully every week, and they'd come down. They'd call out, "Want to pray with the rabbi? Call out your cell number." And then they'd push a little button to open up your gate, and you'd go up. And by the time, this had happened a few times, I remember it as we were standing more or less in a circle. Though at first we may have been sitting on benches. But we'd be gathered around, and he would start to pray in Hebrew. And it would sort of lull off the wardens and all, and then he'd be slipping in little bits of news, world news. And then he'd switch back to Hebrew, and then after a while he'd slip in a little more news. And then he would get to see each of us individually for a couple seconds, and maybe your mother says your aunt is sick, or you'd say, tell my mother, da-di-da, and he'd send out a form letter to all the families with a note at the bottom to keep this communication secret, or it may have to stop. And that was our big thrill of the week. Now, one week, a couple of Catholic guys showed up. And I think they were seminarians.
Yeah, Freedom Riders.
No,
Oh,
they came to minister to us. And you could pick between the rabbi and the seminarians. And, you know, I grew up in a Jewish community, or a lot of Jewish playmates, and a man of God is a man of God. I wasn't going to be picky, but if we had a Christian, I would favor the Christian, even though I wasn't Catholic. But there were no Presbyterians. So I went to pray with the Catholics. Well, now we had girls from Jewish families who were not observant or practicing or whatever. And they had not gone to see the rabbi because they thought that would be sort of hypocritical of them. Man, some of them were down on me for deserting the rabbi and going with the Catholics. I really heard about it. They didn't have anything else to stress over, but I had betrayed the rabbi
Oh, I see.
that they didn't go to pray with.
Yeah.
But the rabbi and I were friends after I got out, and he was out at Tougaloo a lot. So
When we first came into Jackson in 1967, there were 2 Klan bombings we heard. The first was at the synagogue, the second was at Rabbi Nussbaum's home, and that was 6 years later.
yeah,
I'm just gonna move this over a little bit.
I just don't sit like I should.
No, you're just doing a terrible job of sitting here, but the talking is all right, so we'll let it slide.
Thank you.
We're still rolling.
Okay,
You can edit that part out.
No, that's my little cameo.
Okay.
were there any acts of violence committed against you or anyone that you knew in Parchment?
There was a girl who needed some medicine, and they wouldn't give it to her, or called the doctor, and we banged and protested on that one. But as far as, you know, knocking us around, no. Now, the guys I've heard had a different story, but not that I knew of then.
Most people bailed out after 39 days. You didn't. Why?
Well, I didn't need to. I had a 2-month sentence, which covered, and then I had the $200 fine, which every additional day counted $3 against, and hey, free room and board for the summer. I had been accepted at Tougaloo College before the Freedom Rides, and I figured I'm in Mississippi, and the idea was fill the jails and make it so inconvenient for the great and sovereign state and the feds that the law would be obeyed. Sort of a pressure.
So you saw a lot of people come and go then when you were there.
I heard a lot of people
Yeah,
come and
heard,
go.
yes. But did you get new cellmates when your cellmates were?
Yeah, we get new cellmates, and like sometimes if there was a big influx, there might be 3, and I've heard up to 4 women in one cell, and just put the extra mattresses under the cots, the bunks.
So you got out what, the end of August, early September?
Early September, because the rabbi, I remember him telling us that next week I won't be here because it's a holy day, and I have to be with my congregation, and it must have been the New Year. And I got out that week. School started in, not the 1st of September. So if we went back and checked the calendar for that year, we could figure it out. But paid off the rest of the
Had you ever
fine.
set foot on Tougaloo's campus before you?
Nope.
Talk about your coming out and what you've experienced.
Well, and I came out, and you could only leave Parchman on one day of the week, whichever it fell. So I came out and went to the Freedom House on Rose Street, and
In Jackson.
Jackson, and I was there for a couple days before I went to Tougaloo. But this is where I got clothes provided by Women Power Unlimited, and freshened up and saw some old friends at the Freedom House, and then went out to Tougaloo. And I had applied to Tougaloo because in reaction to when Charlene Hunter Galt and Hamilton Holmes had gone to Georgia and been driven off with riots and tear gas. And the picture of Charlene clutching her Madonna just spoke to me. And my family was from Georgia, and relatives could have been in the crowd. So I had felt that if this school integration was for real, it had to be a two-way street. And I would apply to historically black colleges, and okay, they may not want me, but I will reach out. And Tougaloo accepted me. Somebody in SNCC suggested I apply to Tougaloo because there had been no student movement there yet, and it'd be good for you to be there.
There had been the Tougaloo 9.
Not when I applied.
Oh, okay. But the library sit-in
Yes.
had occurred.
After I applied and
Yeah.
all, the library
Yeah.
sit-in and the freedom rides broke
Yeah.
loose, so it was, Mississippi
But
was
you didn't
central.
seek out Tougaloo because of its reputation as being a liberal black college.
No, just being black, and
Did you apply elsewhere other than Tougaloo?
somewhere in Tennessee, and I forget where else, but probably 3 or 4. I wanted a school that was accredited.
Did you hear from the other schools?
I don't think so. But on the other hand, I didn't get all my mail after I left on the Freedom Ride. But Tougaloo had figured that its charter was older than the segregation laws, so it was like grandfathered, and its financial support was from the North.
And occasionally you had the children of white faculty who had been attending classes there.
I'd heard that there'd been, yeah.
So it was not that you were, as it often said, the first white student at Tougaloo.
No, there had been white faculty students taking a course or two, but I don't think regularly
First
enrolled full time.
Enrolled.
Yeah.
Talk about those first days at Tougaloo.
Hold on one second. Okay.
Okay, well, in the meantime, Charlotte Phillips, I think was from Pennsylvania, a white girl, had applied and been accepted. She was having her semester abroad thing. And the first few days, or the first semester, people couldn't tell us apart too well.
All look alike?
Yeah, we all looked alike. And she, about the same height, same size, long hair. Hers was a little darker than mine, but we looked alike. So that led to some interesting and confusing moments. No, that was not me you saw walking back into the woods with that guy. My roommates, there were 4 of us in one room, and they,
What dormitory were you in?
Oh.
Galloway? Or?
the brick one, is that Galloway?
Yeah.
And they didn't know they were getting a white roommate, and I was asleep on the bed, and that was a little surprising. But it was fine. The most interesting or amusing moment was that first night, and the word had not spread. They had bathrooms down the hall, and I was tiptoeing down the hall in a sort of a little flimsy outfit, and a girl was tiptoeing in the other direction and saw me and thought I was a ghost and screamed. And the
True
word got
story,
out.
yeah?
True story, true story. It was a pink and white flowery little, what we called shorties, and
Yeah,
I must have looked otherworldly in more ways than one. But there was no unpleasantness from other students.
Were they curious?
There was some curiosity, and there was sort of a wait and see. But people were friendly enough. And the Freedom Riders had already been back in August when they were called back for court appearance to set trial dates, those who had bailed. And so the idea of white students on the campus was not, breaking news.
And the faculty was predominantly white too.
The faculty was strongly white, probably a little more than 50-50. And there had been these social science forums where white students would come out, and white citizens of Jackson that wanted to come out to Tougaloo.
Dr. Ernst Berinsky.
Ernst Berinsky's, down in the lab, which was
Z-Lab.
Z-Lab, which was a glorified cellar.
Yeah.
An amazing, a book needs to be written about that,
Yes.
that place.
Yeah.
But the idea of whites on campus, including students, was not altogether new, but a full-time enrolled
Living in the dormitory.
living in the dormitory. This was new. And one girl, an AKA, said to me, well, I wasn't sure about you at first, but then I saw you had to study just as hard as we did over in the library. And so I think particularly when I came back the second year I was in, I was still involved with SNCC and CORE down a little part-time.
What were you doing that academic year 61, 62 in terms of movement activity? Should be pointed out that Tougaloo was about 6 miles north of downtown Jackson, so it was somewhat isolated at the time.
To the extent we had a movement on campus, I was involved in that. I mean, whatever was happening. I was also involved in other campus activities. It wasn't just movement. But I would, I guess on weekends or when I could, go down. They had the SNCC Corps office down on Lynch Street, a block or so from Medgar's office, and I would do secretarial work down there. It was generally, well, white women with SNCC did not go into the Delta, did not go outside of Jackson. It would be counterproductive to go get us all killed, which made sense to me. But it kept that movement connection, and had to get my lessons out. God help me with math and science.
What were you majoring in?
Anything that avoided math and science. I thought it was going to be sociology, but it ended up being history because of that 3 hours of statistics.
Oh, yes, yes.
So I would have had a double major except for that 3 hours.
You remember any of your history professors?
Now that you're asking me right off
No.
the top, I remember them and I can picture them, but I can't call their name right now. Ochterman, maybe?
Were they white?
White, yeah.
So the summer of between your first and second year at Tougaloo, what did you do then? Did you stay in Mississippi or?
I think you're asking me to dig back awful far in the
that's all
in the
right.
brain.
It's in the
I
quiz.
think I stayed in Mississippi and worked in this SNCC Corps office.
Well, the 62,
Most of-
63 things were really heating up. SNCC had moved up into the Delta, and some students there, like Joyce and Dory Ladner, were commuting up there. And then a movement started on campus with the campus youth chapter of the NAACP, and that led to...
Now that was in Jackson, North Jackson.
Yeah,
we
North
had
Jackson,
we
yeah.
had our Nonviolent Agitation Association of College People, NAACP, on campus.
I see.
But Ed King's back room became...
Okay,
Ed King was the white chaplain from Vicksburg, and he was very strong on the movement. That's why he was there. And the back bedroom, which was accessible from the back porch, was just sort of the movement room. You could use it as a study hall. His wife Jeanette always had coffee brewing. It's sort of just outside the room. It was also the guest bedroom if Attorney Kunstler was down, and I remember typing up. I could type as fast as he could dictate, so I was typing up legal documents as he was pacing around in his boxer shorts. And what is happening in 62 and what's happening in 63, I really could not
But just
tell
that
you.
whole year.
That whole, yeah, and into the next year. When John Salter was there,
Salter was,
John Salter was a political science professor, Western radical organizer, professor, and he started the North Jackson. Well, he was the adult sponsor of the North Jackson Youth Council of the NAACP, and it's a small campus. His house was also a movement headquarters, and if you weren't over typing for a lawyer or hanging out or something at Ed's, you were over at John's stuffing envelopes for the boycott that got going.
were any black faculty involved in these activities?
I don't remember precisely black faculty involvement, but some of them were supportive, I feel. I couldn't call names unless I got out a yearbook, and I think Mike O'Brien has borrowed my yearbooks. They keep passing around.
No, I asked because, at least when we were there, why it was basically the white faculty who were the activists and the black faculty who maybe were doing other things in town, but they did not have that kind of relationship with the students.
They were not the people whose homes you gathered at for things, but I remember in 66 with the Meredith March, it was Dean Branch's house that was turned into the big breakfast buffet where I sat next to Marlon Brando.
Oh, wow.
That makes it, when you have to have trivia questions about yourself later in life, that's mine.
And it was at Branch's house that they had the long meeting the night before the final day of the march, when they had to hash out who was speaking and in what order. And,
Okay, I missed that part, but yeah.
so back to the North Jackson Youth Council. John Salter is the adult advisor, and what sort of actions were you involved at this level?
I was not involved. Well, I would be at his house a fair amount, but I was not going to the North Jackson meetings. I wasn't in North Jackson. I was with the NAACP agitation group out at Tougaloo, and Joyce Ladner and I were co-chair of that. And we were supportive. We might be stuffing envelopes, but we weren't going to the meetings in Jackson. We were back at campus studying, because we were students first and foremost.
Joyce told me once that we'll get into this, that a boycott was called, and Joyce was saying that she thought that was pretty tame, that she was more interested in what SNCC was doing in the Delta. Do you?
That's possibly true, but there were different settings, and I don't remember Joyce on that point. And we ended up being roommates and sorority sisters. But I was getting the field reports from the Delta, and I would take them and pull out gossip and news and make a little, I don't know, 3 or 4 pages, maybe 2 or 3 pages stapled together that would run off. These were carbon copies. The Mississippi News, taken so that before the internet and cell phones, people would send me a copy of their field report. I would combine it and send it out so that everyone knew what everybody else was doing professionally and personally.
Are any copies of that still available? Do you know? I would have loved to have come across that in my research.
If there are, that would be in the stuff that I've given to the New Smithsonian Museum. I gave them the original of the field reports, which I think the first SNCC reference to Fannie Lou Hamer, for instance. But I have copy machine copies of that.
So you were very much aware of what was going on elsewhere.
Oh yeah, I couldn't go up into the Delta, being white, but I certainly knew what was going on, and people for R&R would be down at Tougaloo or the Freedom House on Rose Street. So I was, in some ways, more in touch with what was going on here and there than some of the people out there were. I remember we went up to Harding Carter's office, Ed King and I forget who else was in the car once. And oh my lands, to openly go up into the Delta. I mean, that was a big
Was
event.
this young Hotting?
No, this was the old guy.
Old Hotting. Oh, I see that.
I guess it was the old guy.
Yeah.
62?
Yeah, no, that was
63, that'd be
his.
the old guy, yeah. Then it was amazing years later to meet the grandson
Yeah.
who had written the books
Mhm.
on his travels. And I had traveled the same routes. And I mean,
Oh.
the Seal River in northern Manitoba, and we'd both been there,
Ah.
days apart. You know, things like that.
Small
But
world department. I got it. Sorry.
coffee time?
Coffee
Co-
time.
Okay, we're rolling.
In 1962, Jackson, Mississippi, the capital, was a segregated city. And the civil rights activists were trying to change all that. And events unfolded that would have national and international significance in terms of what was going on. Talk a little bit about the boycott, your role in it, the mood on campus in town in early 1963.
Well, the boycott had been going, I think, over Christmas.
That was the boycott downtown.
The
Merchants.
downtown merchants, and I guess building. I was busy being a student,
Yeah.
but by spring, it had to escalate a bit. And demonstrations, there had been some picket demonstrations and people arrested and students and faculty, and the point now coming that need to step it up a little bit more. And apparently a sit-in was planned. I wasn't in on the planning of this. And I wasn't supposed to be part of that sit-in. There were going to be heard different versions of this. There was either going to be two demonstrations, complete entities of themselves, or the picket line down the street was to be a diversion to draw the police down there. That's what I'd always understood. And I was going to be a spotter. And now a spotter is a person who just sort of blends into the crowd, sees what's happening, has some dimes in their pocket to call Medgar Evers' office and say, hey, they've been arrested, they've been beaten up, or whatever.
Now, Medgar Evers was...
Medgar Evers was the state's NAACP man, the longtime civil rights person before us outsiders got into the act, the key figure in the state. And so Lois Chafee, who was a dorm mother, though not really much older than us, and I were the spotters for the picket line. And we didn't think they were going to get arrested right away.
And Salter's wife, Eldry, was in the picket line? Or was
I
it-
don't remember who was in it,
Yeah.
to be honest.
Was it integrated or...
It was an integrated
Yeah.
picket line. She may well have been in it. Eddie O'Neill, the student body president, I think, was in it. We thought the police would come down and arrest them right away, and that would give time for the people who are going to be sitting in down at Woolworth's to get into the store and make their little purchase and get situated. But the picket line was arrested right away. And so here Lois and I are, we're phoned in. And okay, now what are we going to do? Let's go down to Woolworth and see what's happening there.
And they didn't think, the planners didn't think much would happen. Pretty much the same thing, that they would be arrested and
They
taken
thought
to jail.
the people sitting, as I understood it at the time, they thought the people sitting in would be arrested right away. And we would just be, the picket line would just be a diversion to give them time to get in, and then the police would come down there and arrest them. Well, the Supreme Court had had a ruling the week before that the police could not, of their own volition, go into a store and make arrest. They had to be invited in by the store manager. The irony being that my name was on one of the cases that had been consolidated for this, coming out of Durham. And there were cases from other, I think Lynn Echo also was in on
Be
this.
careful what you ask for.
Yes. Well, we got down to Woolworth, and there was a crowd forming. It was sort of getting ugly, and This
Now,
was
what time of the day was this?
sort of noonish. The Central High School was just a couple blocks away, I think, and students were coming up on their lunch hour because it was exam week and
These were white students.
white students. And I think some of the segregationist honchos, the Sovereignty Commission or whatever, were sort of encouraging people to come up and come in the store. Well, Memphis Norman got pulled. There were 3 students from Tougaloo sitting down: Annie, Moody, Memphis Norman, and Perlina Lewis, and they were sitting together with Memphis in the middle, and he got pulled off the stool and stomped and kicked, and that's a long story, well known, and carted off by the police, along with the guy who was attacking him, who was a former policeman known for his brutality. That left the 2 girls alone. They were pulled off their stools, struggled back. Things were getting more and more mob scene-ish.
And the police were nowhere to be seen? Or?
Oh no, they were outside laughing. Ed King was the white chaplain was the spotter there, and talking with the police who, we can't go in, the Supreme Court ruling, we have to obey it. And I think it was probably Ed who suggested that I sit down with the girls, that it would be safer for me, because I was starting to be sort of spotted. I think I'd maybe called out to one of the girls that somebody had a knife. And it'd be safer for me. You're always safer if you've got a solid barrier on one side of you. That limits how many directions they can come at you. And it would be good moral support for the 2 girls at the counter. So I sat down. And then we got pulled off the stools again, and I got up to but we were able to get loose and get back to the counter, but not back to where Perlina was. And Lois sat with Perlina, so you had a black and white girl here, and Annie and I sat black and white girl here. And little people would bravado and do this and do that, throw something at us, dump some ketchup maybe. And then Ed has called back to Medgar's office, and Medgar wants to come down, but he's talked out of it because he'd be killed pretty much on sight. But John comes down. John Salter, the white professor, comes down, and he makes his way to where Annie and I are sitting. I think Walter Williams, who had been the student body president at Jackson State, but expelled for supporting, I think, the Tougaloo 9 sit-in, library sit-in group. Well, things keep going, and there's Annie looking like a skunk with the white sugar on her head, and me with all sorts of nice condiments, and John Salter, who really got the brunt of the attack because he was a guy, and brass knuckles mixing blood with the mustard and things. Got called the Mustard Man by the press. Now, the guys in sunglasses, as I understand it, were all FBI agents, cleverly disguised. But basically, it's high school students who were there. The reporter, a local guy, Fred Blackwell, was literally standing on the counter when he took this shot, as I understand it.
I just want to interrupt. That is one of the most iconic photographs of the civil rights movement, probably shown more than any other. And at the Kennedy Library in Massachusetts, it's a huge blow-up photo.
Ooh, that's worth a trip to Massachusetts.
Oh, yes, but more so than the Woolworth or the Greensboro sit-ins. I mean, this has become.
This has become it.
Yeah.
I think the Greensboro sit-in is so nice and orderly. This one, you have a definite feel of violence is imminent, but there is no actual violence happening at the moment the camera clicked.
Yeah.
But it tells the story, and it's an integrated group. So it's good to use in books for children. Cut. Stray all the time.
Oh, no, that worked better that way.
Okay, we're all set.
Yeah. Now this picture is also the basis for a lot of illustrations for kids' books, but something I've noticed very consistently in the illustrations. The person that would be me is always black. Now, I understand they want it to look like a black movement, black students, but why doesn't John Salter ever turn black? Why is it always the female? I can give several answers to this, but
I'm curious, what are your thoughts?
the main thought I have, well, aside from they want it to look like a black movement, but why always me rather than John is it has to do with the old thing about protecting white women from the black men. And I may be reading too much into it. It may be coincidental, but I just sort of wonder what this says about our lingering racial attitudes.
That's very interesting. Should be point out that the photograph there is the cover of a book that features the World War sit-in and the Jackson movement. We Shall Not Be Moved by Michael O'Brien. Wonderful book.
And here we've got not only the lunch counter one, but at the beginning with Memphis sitting with the two girls and Memphis being stomped. He was bleeding out of every opening in his head.
Yeah, that's the photograph you don't see much of.
No.
And that's where you really get the full effect of the violence.
It's much better for kids' books to show this one.
Yes.
But I've talked to several reporters, probably all the reporters that were behind the counter and the cameramen or their descendants. And across the board, this is the most frightening experience at a demonstration they had in the civil rights movement. Now, granted, none of them were in Birmingham for the bus burning or the riots, but just for Mississippi, and they got around.
What was so particularly horrifying to me? I mean, how long did this go on?
I lost track of time. I think it's supposed to have been about 3 hours or
3
so.
hours. If you can imagine what it was like to be there for that amount of time with the crowd apparently not under control.
Completely out of control and the police laughing.
You were a veteran of sit-ins. This was something new for you. What were your thoughts? What were your feelings when your back was to these people and you didn't know what was coming?
Of course, you were safer with the back, and I think we may have had a bit of a mirror at the lunch counters where you could sort of see some of it.
Oh, okay.
But our conversation, we kept it light, joking. Professor Salter gave us much too hard of exams, but it was a deliberate attempt to keep our spirits up. And for me, it was sort of like an out-of-body experience at some point. And I've heard this happens, on the battlefield. Like the real me had left and was sort of like up there like a guardian angel, keeping an eye on things, looking out for me. And this was just a shell that was sitting at the counter. And
So
it's protective.
Yeah. Anything else that stands out in your mind about that particular demonstration?
Well, our college president, when he heard about it, came down and worked it out, negotiating that the police would give us safe passage once the store was closed, that cars could be brought up to pick us up. The manager didn't want to close the store, but apparently his regional district man said to, but our college president did come down and get things worked out and actually sat at the counter, albeit down a bit talking to the reporters, but he's the only college president who sat at a lunch counter where his students were. Got to give him credit there.
I can't understand why the manager didn't close the store. I mean, they were tearing it apart.
Well, I think it was when they were seriously tearing it apart, because they'd used up all the stuff that was real handy and were going further and further into the store.
And there were ashtrays and things like that were...
Had to have been.
Yeah.
I mainly remember the condiments coming at us, spray paint and stuff.
Yeah.
But
Were you hit at all? You said you were pulled off the chair.
I don't think I wasn't like slugged.
Yeah.
Pushed around, yes, and sort of carried by the waist virtually to the store exit where the guy actually got arrested.
Yeah.
But I think,
And then you went back.
oh, of course, where else was I going to go? Into the mob? That was the point. Number one, that you stay at the counter. You try to shield each other. But literally, if I went out of the store, the mob was forming outside. I could have been, that would have been more dangerous than returning to the counter. And the press was there.
So what happens? You are, finally the store is cleared, you are led out to a waiting car. What
Cars
next?
pull up, and they take us back to the black community, down near Medgar's office, and the ladies were taken over to the beauty parlor across the street, and that's Woman Power Unlimited type thing. We got all cleaned up over there.
Was there a mass meeting that night?
A mass meeting that night, and man, it was packed.
This was the chapel at Tougaloo?
No, this was
The churches
a
down
church in one of the, I forget the name of the church, but whatever the main meeting church was in the black community. And of course on campus there's always a to-do too, but mainly that evening where we all got introduced and we were cleaned up by then.
Well, things start to happen rapidly in Jackson after that. The National NAACP, which had been sort of on the sidelines, realizes that this is big news. The national office comes to town. Roy Wilkins gets himself arrested. And yet at the same time, there is an effort on the part of the Kennedy administration, we know this from the records, to get people out of the streets, to arrange some sort of a compromise. Birmingham had exploded already. The Kennedys did not want to see anything like this happen in Jackson. How much of this were you aware of on campus, that things that had been at white heat were now sort of tampering back?
Well, you see, this was right at the end of the school year, and I left within a day or two. And came back to Washington and worked in the March on Washington office all summer. So I was mainly getting just whatever was in the Washington Post, I think.
So you weren't there for
I
the
wasn't
final
there.
days.
John Doerr was amazing, another hero.
Yeah.
Medgar's body was at a funeral home up here, and the lines were around the block to go in and see him.
Because he was buried at Arlington.
He was buried at Arlington. I still have the black crepe ribbon that they gave us to pin on our clothes or armbands or whatever.
We should probably mention that at the height of all this, Medgar Evers was assassinated by a member of the White Citizens Council, Byron DeLay Beckwith, and at the funeral there were demonstrations, and that John Doerr of the Justice Department was able to keep things from exploding into a full riot. By this time you were back in Washington, working on the March on Washington. Do you want any more you want to say about the Jackson movement, or should we move on to Washington?
I can't really speak to the Jackson movement right then because I wasn't there.
Yeah.
I was here, basically working in the press section at the March on Washington headquarters. And we certainly didn't assume that the march was going to come off or smoothly. The newspapers were full of stories of worries about riots. Merchants were boarding up their windows downtown.
People don't realize that now, huh?
The American Nazi Party was right across the river. There was a real fear of violence in the city. Plus, at the March office, we figured that it was also quite likely that the federal government would intervene and literally prevent the buses from rolling into Washington. So the fact that that took place was wonderful.
Yeah.
I was working in the press tent up on the monument grounds and did not literally march, though we got sort of bussed up closer. But it had been an awful year. I mean, not only did King write his, well, he didn't write it, but have his dream speech, but he had written the letter from the Birmingham jail that spring. There had been the whole Birmingham scene. There had been the whole Jackson scene. It was awful. And there were a few other things. I mean, that's just the ones that...
So there were more demonstrations that summer. Than
Danville,
any other
yeah.
year.
And then to have the march come off gloriously. in spite of John Lewis being censored.
Yeah.
And then just over 2 weeks later, the church in Birmingham was bombed and those girls killed.
You came back, didn't you, from the March on Washington with Ed King and a group?
Yeah, Ed and Annie and I came back with the Kings.
This is, by the way, Ann Moody, who wrote the book Coming of Age of Mississippi.
Yes.
Which is,
And we camped in a national park, I think along the Blue Ridge or Shenandoah National Park. And when we came out of the shower room together, we got quite the looking over. But we got back and went to school, and then there was a church bombing. So a van load of us went over to the funerals for 3 of the girls, and there was still glass in the gutters, which we were picking up, and shotgun shells where the police had fired over the heads of the people coming out of the bombed church. And to me, that was the absolute worst day in the movement. Sharpshooters on the roofs of buildings with the guns pointed down at the crowds in the street, which sort of makes you wonder.
did you, then coming back, was it more difficult to get involved in movement activity, or were you more determined?
Oh, we were right back. Well, I was a student at Tougaloo. We were right back into it. We were by then having the church visits.
Talk about that.
The church visits had started that summer, I think maybe just before Medgar was killed, but while the cattle barns were being filled up with demonstrators in Jackson. And to try to speak to the conscience of the people going to church, would you welcome Jesus? And integrated groups would go to the churches, and sometimes the police would move in and arrest them. Sometimes they would be turned away and leave. And the police arrested them. It was before they had a chance to leave. And, of course, there would be spotters. And by fall, when I got back, it was ministers would sometimes come down from the north and try to visit their denomination with students, or it'd be a black and white group of ministers and what have you. And every once in a while, you'd get in church.
Can you remember those occasions?
I think Fondren Presbyterian I got into, my group got into.
St. Andrew's Episcopal, was that?
I don't remember. I honestly don't remember. But we always knew that the Catholic Church and Chancery were a sanctuary if we were downtown. We'd known that for years, that if you're trapped downtown, if you can make it to the Catholics, you're home safe.
Interesting.
Was that based on the medieval concept of sanctuary in the Catholic Church, or was this a local?
I think this was the local priest. But the Catholics had been more open to everyone. Come unto me, all ye who labor and are heavily laden, and I will give you rest.
Galloway Methodist was a major target, wasn't it?
Yes.
Saw pictures of the deacons out on the steps turning you away.
Yeah, it was the downtown churches were big, and Joyce Ladner, who was my roommate, ended up married to this gentleman who was an ambassador somewhere in Africa, and a group of Methodist ministers were coming to visit, and she was being the lovely ambassador's wife, serving tea, and, oh, where are you from? Oh, and what church? Oh, Galloway. Oh, I was arrested on the steps of your church. Go, Joyce. That must have been an interesting conversation.
Yes.
But, I mean, things go around a lot. And
Well, they've had an impact. I mean, the Reverend Seeley, the Galloway minister, resigned when his church
Yes.
would not allow an integrated service.
yeah. And there's been a radical change. But I've met people in recent years in Mississippi who, by way of introduction and explaining who they were, my father was one of the signers of the statement of conscience that the 28 or 30 whatever ministers came up with, and most Methodists, and most were forced from their churches in Mississippi. but still that's a way of identifying you themselves.
It's extremely difficult to be white in Mississippi and to do anything except be quiet or support the Citizens Council or risk, as Ed King did, being ostracized throughout the
Yeah,
community.
and it's understandable those that didn't make a loud noise, but an awful lot of people did things quietly and, somewhat behind the scenes. So I can understand the current pope
Yeah.
may well have opposed the dictators in
Yeah.
in Argentina. Yeah, I can believe every word that he was
Yeah.
working behind the scenes.
Spring of '64, graduation day. That's something people look forward to. Anne Moody writes about it in her book. What were your thoughts? And had you decided then what you were going to do after graduation?
Well, contrary to what Anne says, I was not planning to come back for Freedom Summer. I had already decided that I had come to Mississippi to be a student, and it just felt natural to leave when I was no longer, once I got my degree. And so the obvious place to go back to was Washington, D.C.
The summer project, later known as Freedom Summer, plans were underway. Were you actively involved in any of those activities?
I could
before?
type, man, I could type.
Yeah, you were.
And I remember with Bob Moses at the Freedom House on Rose Street, we were talking about it, and he just agonizing over, do we have the right to encourage students to come down for the summer knowing that someone will be killed?
Oh, that's interesting, because that was a question throughout in
Yeah.
the movement.
You know, we can tell them that someone's going to be, but they really won't understand. Now, actually, I was almost killed to stop Freedom Summer on the road back from Canton.
Talk about that.
Canton had been completely off limits to whites in the movement. It was such a rough town. And it was under curfew. School year was over. Freedom Summer was looming. Over at Ed King's, we decided to take a carload of everyone white in the car to the mass meeting that night. It was Ed's car, but decided it'd be better to let Hamid Kisselbosh from Pakistan drive. Swarthy white. And the meeting was over before the curfew so people could get home. We noticed we weren't being followed when we left campus and heading into Canton. And we weren't being followed by the police. There were no police around when we left, but realized that we were being followed. And the interstate had just opened, and we were in that sort of little no man's land between the old road and the new road and the interstate. We were being followed, and we got boxed off out in that little stretch. And guys with crowbars coming out. Now, a couple days before, or the day before, the leader of the opposition party in the legislature or parliament in India had been arrested in Jackson, going Gandhian style in sympathy with us to a restaurant. And this had upset the embassy in Washington, which passed the word to the State Department, which passed it down to the state of Mississippi, who obviously passed it on to local law enforcement officials. I was in the back seat. Ed was in the front with Hamid, and long story, but they got the door open, beating on Hamid, and Ed telling them, don't hit him. He's a foreigner. He's not part of, we're whites, we're local. He's a foreigner. He's from India. He's from India. Don't hit him. He's from India. And Hamid is dazed and bleeding. I'm from Pakistan. I'm from Lahore. What's that? That's his city in India. And the guy that Ed was making eye contact with the most, who seemed to be the leader, gradually pulled the others off, suggesting that he was had gotten the word and had law enforcement connections. And we got out of there. And the governor had said that there would be there was no violence, and if there was, he wanted to be the first to know. So I went to the governor's mansion, but dripping blood up the steps, Ed and Hamid, and once they realized who they were, the governor was, couldn't get in, went to the hospital. Oh, we stopped at the State Highway Patrol on the way, and they said if you have a problem, you have to go back to Canton and tell them. Well, that was not not a pretty picture. So then the governor's mansion, then the hospital, and my understanding is that we were supposed to have been killed that night to stop Freedom Summer.
Oh.
This comes, Ed said, a Klan informer or undercover got this word to them. And the fact that we didn't die that night meant that 3 other guys did. 2 of them were our friends.
Yeah.
Cheney and Schwerner were on campus a lot. We knew them.
Yeah.
And
So that was sort of your last, not your last memory of Mississippi, but the last confrontation.
my last confrontation was almost being
Yeah.
offered up for Freedom Summer.
And then you were back home and you were reading about the deaths of the civil rights workers and everything. What were your feelings then? Did you second guess yourself? Did you wish you were back in it?
No, but you knew they were dead.
Mm-hmm.
I was working at the Smithsonian, and I guess I got on with a few of the black workers well enough that they knew felt I was one of them. There was always a question with who was I one of? This had been on campus with the visiting white ministers who thought I was one of them, as opposed to the students who thought I was one of them. It led to some weird moments. But one of the black workers told me that they had brought in Cheney's body on the weekend after dark to be examined by the forensic people there, and there was not a bone in his body that was not broken. Now, this never saw anything in the press. This was just word in the hallways, which I tend to believe.
Well, it did. It did get into the press because Dr. Spain from the Medical Committee for Human Rights examined him. And it was that famous comment that went all over the world, saying the only time I've seen a body so beaten up was in an airplane crash. So that word did get out. But before, in the original with the Mississippi examiners, nothing was said of that.
Now, I've seen references to it, badly beaten, every bone, all this, but I didn't hear it in the Smithsonian. But I could have missed that.
Well, I mean, that was the original story that went out, and that was why Dr. Spain's examination, which he made at the request of Mrs. Cheney, which also took a lot of guts on her part, that then it was just a cover-up.
Yeah.
And we don't know exactly what went on, but the best evidence we have from informers is that both Goodman and Schwerner were shot, and that Cheney tried to run away, and they literally beat him before they shot him. But it was the kind of thing that part of Freedom Summer was to get the attention of the world. In a sad way, that did, and things started to change after that.
This whole thing of being brought in a body bag after dark on the weekend and through it was just being whispered around the halls of the Smithsonian at that point.
Yeah. So, you said you came back for the Meredith March. Was that your first time in Mississippi back from after you left, or had you gone down before?
Oh, the Meredith March was
1966.
66. I don't think I'd been back, though I might have. I've been in and out of Mississippi regularly over the years. The Meredith March, we went back for that.
Where did you pick up the Meredith March?
At Tougaloo.
At Tougaloo.
Where, I had friends, I mean, that was the idea. Some of us went from Washington straight to Tougaloo, 2 couples. And somebody had to have given me some papers that I folded and slipped into my New Testament that I always carried on demonstrations. I mean, you're having a sit-in or a tense moment, reading the Bible was the thing to do. And they must have been the very first references to Black Power, and on a flyer.
Yeah.
One was, from reading it, was issued the night that they were tear gassed in Canton, and the other was the next morning. The two, one was just a half of a legal sheet, and the morning one was an explanation of why we're calling for a boycott. I keep wondering if that really is the first printed reference, but
It may
the
be
Cry Black
because
Power came up the week before
in Greenwood. Yes, Stokely.
Then this was the week later in Canton, and a week later the Washington Post political cartoon has Black Power, something like SNCC, and Gray Power or something, NAACP, in the political cartoon in the Post, which at that point was a very prominent.
It was her block.
Yeah, I don't think this was her blocks, but if you had something in the Post, that was, second only to the New York Times.
Yes.
Newspapers meant something.
Yes. No, that was the march where Black Power was born, and the movement began to go in a different direction then, although blacks had been talking about power for a long time before.
But now Stokely, for all that Black Power, we went back to his pontificating days and the demonstrations with NAG and the Freedom Ride. And in the mid-'70s, he was speaking at the Smithsonian, probably one of Bernice Regan's King Day programs. And I had taken down my youngest two, who at most were 4. And Stokely was the speaker, and probably the most feared man in white America. And there was a break, and people could, mill about, restrooms, whatever. And I said to my friends I was sitting with, black and particularly white, I'm remembering, I'm going to take the kids out. I must have just had the two to meet Stokely. As, oh, Joan, don't. Something will happen, and it'll be upsetting, and they won't understand. No, I'm going to do it. So I take the twins out, these little freckled-faced, blonde, Irish-looking kids, St. Patrick's Day, to meet Stokely. Now, between Stokely in the lobby and the entrance from Constitution Avenue is a semicircle of bodyguards from the nation, looking very intimidating. Stokely's talking to some officials. I catch his eye. He cuts off the conversation with the big wigs, motions me over. Stokely, I'd like my kids to meet you. And Stokely was, 6'2", 6'3"? This towering, fearful figure knelt on the floor to talk eyeball to eyeball to them, shake their hands, and what's your name, and how old are you, and all this little stuff. I mean, we were old friends.
Yeah.
And that counted more than the raised fist.
There was a side to him people didn't see.
And I've heard other white folks who knew him from back in the day with similar stories of him going out of his way to acknowledge their presence and interact with them.
One white from Duke who said that he was at a speech that Stokely gave, one of the fire and brimstone speeches, and then afterwards, they went back to this guy's house and drank wine and listened to classical music.
You know Joan Browning?
Yes.
She has a story of Stokely going out of his way to come over and
Yeah.
interact
No,
in that.
It's too bad that image is the only one that most people will have. Tell us, we thank you so much, but we want to know something about your life in the last 50 years. Could you tell us what you've been doing?
Well, I came back and worked a number of menial jobs because don't hire women. They just get married and have babies and quit.
Yeah.
So I got married and had babies and quit, 5 of them, boys. Involved in the community things and the schools and PTAs and speaking for the school board a number of times on issues that you could trace back to the civil rights movement perspective, and in the classroom as a teaching assistant for close to 30 years, and brought a lot of perspectives and just thinking outside the box and appreciation of understanding of cultural issues to the classroom. And now that I'm retired from that, I'm still speaking.
Still agitated.
Still, anybody who's writing a book or making a movie or wants to do an oral history and wants a speaker for an event or at their community college classroom, I'm happy to go.
Well, with that in mind, I would like,
Particularly if they feed me.
to thank you. Well, this has been an enlightening interview. But before we go, I want to add that one of Joan Trumpauer Mulholland's son, Loki Mulholland, has a video documentary about his mother's life titled An Ordinary Hero, The True Story of Joan Mulholland. We'll get a 0 in on that right away. And what a fitting tribute, and from your son.
Amazing.
Make you very proud.
I had to do something right raising him.
Thanks again.
Thank you.
Oh, that was great.
That was terrific.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.